Welcome to the lecture. Today we will study the phylum Mollusca. So you may have seen the snail in your vicinity and you may have heard about the octopus. So these kind of animals, they do belong to the phylum Mollusca. These phylums share common ancestry with the phylum Annelida and consist of various kind of animals which include the snails, two-shelled organism, tusk shell and the tooth cells, octopus, and the organism in which shell is lacking, an organism in which shell is present, however that is present in the form of multiple plates. So in this lecture we will gonna see the general characters and the classification of phylum Mollusca. This phylum Mollusca, that is the second largest phylum in the animal kingdom and after the Arthropoda, and consists of about 1,60,000 living species and about 70,000 species in the form of fossils. So what are the fossils? Fossils are the dead remains of organisms that get preserved inside the earth crust. So if we see for the mollusca, so the ammonite cells are the perfect example for the fossilized mollusk. Among living organisms, though they consist of very simple organism to the most complex organism that can be present in the invertebrate group. So these are the solenogasters, these are the chitons, squids, bivalves, the snails, the two-shelled organism, the bivalves, and the cephalopods. Regarding the size of organism, they can be microscopic organism, they can have very large size. So they can attain a perimeter of about 20 meters even. So for example, one organism, Tridecna, that is a kind of bivalve that can attain a length of about 1.5 meter and can be around 250 kg. Regarding the habitat of organism, they can be present on the tropical region and they can be present in the polar region. So in the tropical region the temperature is very high, in the polar region the temperature is very low. So you can imagine the temperature condition a molluscan body can sustain. These molluscan, they can be present on the sea floor and can be present at the elevation of around 7,000 meter above the sea levels. So if we, as they could be the benthic kind of organism, so they must be aquatic one. So the aquatic environment, they can be present in three types, like they could be present in marine environment, they can be present in the brackish water, they can be present in the fresh water. So for most of the mollusks, they present in the marine environment. However, one class that can be present in the brackish water and can be present in the fresh water, that class is class bivalves. And one class members, they can be present in the terrestrial habitat on the land. So you have seen the snail on the land, that snail that belongs to the class Gastropoda. So these gastropodons, they can be present in the marine environment, they can be present in the brackish environment, they can be present in the freshwater, they can be present on the land. So except aerial life, they are present everywhere. So as we have seen, there is very high diversity in the habitat forms among these two classes. So about 90% of the species that belongs to the phylum Mollusca, though belongs to these two classes. Regarding the habits of the organisms, they are mainly the filter feeders, they can be the bottom feeders, they can be predatory in nature, and the development in the case of molluscan, that is mainly the indirect development. So there must be some kind of larvae. So the larva is present is known as trochophore larvae. This trochophore larval form, that is similar to that is present in case of the phylum Annelida. So the Annelida phylum that also contain the larvae, that is known as the trochophore larvae. So the organism, they are bilaterally symmetrical, they are prostomous, and they are eucoelomate kind of organisms. So what is the prostomous organisms? So during the development of organisms, so when the blastula that undergoes gastrulation, there is formation of blastopore. So if that blastopore, that give rise to the mouth, the organisms are known as prostomas. So, if that blastophore that forms the anus, those organisms are known as deuterostomas. So the next phylum, that is the Echinodermata, you will gonna see those are the deuterostomas kind of organism. The eusylomate, that means the body cavity, that is the coelom, that is lined by the mesoderm from the both of the side, from the body wall side as well as from the gut wall side. So regarding the development of coelom, so here the coelom is get formed by the splitting of mesodermal mass. So that kind of coelom is known as schizocele, and the animals are known as schizocelic animals. As this is the second largest phylum in the animal kingdom, so they vary in the size, in the shape, and in their body plan. However, they contain specific things that includes the mantle, visceral mass, shell, radula, and the muscular foot. So if we see a typical muscular molluscan body, so you can see this is the head region. This head that has the mouth. This is the radular sac. Here in the near the mouth there is a radula that is present. This is the ventral portion that is known as foot. This is the gill. This is the alimentary canal. This is the anus. The outermost thing that you seen in the molluscan body, that is the shell. This shell is secreted by the layer underneath that is known as mantle. This is the heart. The heart is surrounded by a cavity that is known as pericardial cavity, and you can see here that this sea green color, this is known as visceral mass. So what happen in case of molluscans, as they are the coelomates. So what is the function of coelom? Coelom actually surround the body organs, so provide some kind of cushions to them. However, in case of molluscan, the coelom is very restricted, that present only around the heart, and that makes the pericardial cavity. So this pericardial cavity is the coelom of the organism. However, the coelom is absent from any other organs. So there must be something that provides some cushion to the other organs. So the tissue that is made up of connective tissue and the muscles that form a cushion around the organs, like that of the alimentary canal, the gonads, and every organs, that mass or the tissue, they are known as the visceral mass. Here the mantle, that is the epithelial layer of the organism that surround most of the organism body. The visceral mass that underlies the mantle and surrounded the various organs. The shell is the outermost covering of the organism that is formed of calcium carbonate, and that has the protective function. The radula is associated with the mouth and helps in the feeding of organism. Then the muscular foot, that is ventral in position and going to help the animals in its locomotion. So one by one we will see these the hallmark of molluscan body. The first is the mantle. So you can see here this portion is known as shell that you see in the molluscan body, and this shell is secreted by the layer underneath that is known as the mantle. So mantle is the epithelial layer or the epidermal layer that is present in the body of the organism. So in the mantle there are various sense organ that lies. The ocelli, the sensory papilla, they lie on the mantle surface, and various glands, they are also present in this mantle. They gonna secrete some kind of mucus, as well as this layer, this cell, that is also secreted by some kind of glands that are present in the this mantle layer. In some places the mantle hangs down to create the mantle cavity, like you can see, like this is the visceral mass, but at some places this mantle that can hangs over the visceral mass and forms a cavity. This cavity that get formed by the overhanging of the mantle, that is known as mantle cavity. So this mantle cavity that around or that houses the respiratory organs. So you can see the gills. So these gills, they are present in this mental cavity, and the ducts of digestive system, the excretory system, and the reproductive system, they also emptied inside this mental cavity. Like, and this is the alimentary canal that opens by the anus in the mental cavity. Then there are gonads, they also release the sperms by the means of ducts in this mental cavity. Then the excretory system, that will gonna see, you will gonna see the metanephridium that are present, they also excrete their waste matter in this mental cavity. So this mental cavity that houses the respiratory organ as well as the duct of digestive, excretory, and the reproductive system. So a continuous current of the water that is created by the cilia that are present on these gills. So cilia, they beat continuously and draw the water from the surrounding environment. And that water that also bring the food and oxygen. The food is taken up by the mouth, and the oxygen that will taken up by the gills for the respiration. And the water that also taken up the waste and the gametes to the outside environment. So like in the molluscan body, that is very, very delicate. However, the hard part, that is only the shell that is present on the body of the organism. So if that shell is present, and head and that of the foot, that are the delicate portion, if that remain outside, they will not get that much protection from the predator. So if the organism that is able to retract its head as well as the foot inside the shell, so that will gonna give the better protection to the organism. So some organism, they can do this thing and can be able to protect themselves better from the predators. Sometimes this mantle that also act as a respiratory organ. So this mantle that is very, very vascular, and it is a thin layer, and it is always moist. So it is an excellent respiratory membrane in some mollusks. The second part is the visceral mass, as we have seen, that is formed of the muscles and the connective tissue, and the body organs, they are embedded in this solid mass. So this is known as the visceral mass. So as the true cavity that is only restricted around the heart, this is the coelom, and whole of the body organs, they are embedded in this visceral mass. In this visceral mass, there are some kind of lacunas, or the spaces that are present. So blood that also flows in these spaces. So if the blood that flows in the lacunas or the sinuses, that form the open circulatory system. So in case of mollusk, you will gonna see the open circulatory system, and these fluids in this, they will gonna form the hemocoel. The next part is the shell. This shell is created by the mantle, and it acts as some kind of protective exoskeleton. There is a great variation associated with the shell in its form as well as in its structure. So you can see in case of chitons, the shell is present, but that is in the form of multiple plates. So 1, 2, 3, 4, about 8 plates that are present in case of chitons. In case of gastropodon, like that of the snails, a single shell is present, and that is spiral in shape. In case of bivalves, 2 cells preserve a single organism. The organism present in these 2 shells, and these 2 cells, these are held together by the dorsal hinge. In case of cephalopods, there could be a single external shell, there could be a presence of internal shell, or there might be a shell that is altogether absent from the organism body. This shell that is formed of calcium carbonate, and this calcium carbonate is extracted by the animals, by the mollusk, from the water, soil, and the food. And it is composed of 3 layers. The 3 layers are the periostracum layer, that is the outermost layer, the prismatic layer, that is the middle layer, and the nacreous layer, that is the innermost layer of the shell. The periostracum layer, that is the outermost layer, that is composed of a protein that is also known as conchiolin. This is an organic protein that helps the organism from the acidic pH. So if the pH is acidic, that is mainly in the freshwater. So in the freshwater molluscans, this layer, periostracum layer, that is thick. However, in case of marine, where there is the pH toward the neutral, so the periostracum, that is thin, or it may be absent from the organism shell. The second layer is the prismatic layer, in which the crystal of calcium carbonate, they are densely filled. In case of nacreous layer, It is very glossy in appearance. It is also known as mother of pearl because it gives some kind of characteristic that is known as iridescence. So what is iridescence? So if we see this part of the shell from this angle and we see the same part from the different angle, we will gonna see two different color. So because of this mother of pearl that is very magnificent. So what happen now? So in case of the mollusk or mainly the bivalves, so when there is a particle that get enter in between the shell and the mantle, so external particle that could be a sand particle or that could be the parasite, if that get in between the shell and the mantle, now the mantle treat this particle as a foreign body. So now as a body defense, it will secrete the same material as that of the mother pearl around that particle. So a concentric ring of mother of pearl that will gonna deposited around that particle and there is formation of pearl. So that's how a pearl that get formed. Then the next part is the radula. So radula is a tongue-like rasping organ that is present in the mouth. So this is the radular sac. Here is the presence of radula. So what is the radula? The radula is some kind of hard, curved and ribbon-like structure. So that has numerous teeth on the on its surface. So these are the teeth that are associated, that are present on the radula. This radula that is supported by a cartilage that is known as odontophore. So this is the cartilage that is known as odontophore, and this odontophore that is provided by the various muscles. So these muscles, they helps the cartilage in to and fro motion. So what is the to and fro motion? Though it helps the odontophore to move forward position to move the backward position. So what happens? So when the molluscan that see a particle of food or something, they come its vicinity, and with the to and fro motion of this cartilage, the particle that are cleaved into the minute pieces, and this radula that also act as some kind of conveyor belt, so help in the movement of those fine particle inside the esophagus. So that are the function of the radula. The last part is the foot in the molluscan body. So almost every mollusk that has the thick and muscular foot, that is mainly equipped for the locomotion. However, there are other functions that are also associated with the foot. So the first are the creeping movement. In case of snail, you have seen that these snails, they move by the muscular contractions of the foot, and they also release some kind of slimy material. So that slimy material that decrease the friction between the substratum and that of the foot and increase the locomotory efficiency. In some mollusks like that of bivalves and the scapopod, this foot that is used to dig inside the sand. So half of the body or the most of the body that is digged inside the sand, and some part of the body that remains in the outside water. In some bivalves, there is a presence of visceral glands that are present on the foot. So those visceral glands, those release some kind of threads, and those threads that get attached to some substratum. These threads are also known as sea silk, and they are formed of protein keratin. So these sea silk or these threads, they help the organism in their swinging movement. So they hang from the substratum. On the other hand, this foot that also secretes some kind of mucus or adherence substance that let the organism to totally adhere with the substratum. So here the organism hang from the from the substratum. Here the organism totally attached with the substratum. So as in case of limpet, so this is the limpet example. This is Monoplacophora neoplena. This is the Scapopoda. This is the Gastropodons. So seeing the feeding and digestion in the organism, they are the detritus feeder, they are could be the borer, grazers, carnivores, or could be the filter feeders. So there is a complete digestive tract here. So there is a mouth that is present, and that alimentary canal that opens by anus in the mantle cavity. So the foregut receive and prepare food. The foregut constitute the mouth, consist of mouth, the radula sac, and the buccal cavity. So the radula that forms the minute particle of the feeding material, and they get transported in the esophagus. The esophagus that receive the food and helps in the sorting and the crushing of the food. So the esophagus, the stomach, and the digestive gland that are associated with the stomach, digestive glands, they pour their excretion in the stomach and helps in the crushing of food and digestion of food. So that digested matter that moves with the intestine, and here in the intestine there will be absorption of nutrient, and there will be the undigested matter that will be ingested out through the anus in the mental cavity. So the most internal organ, including the digestive system, they are embedded in the solid tissue, like you are seeing the greenish tissue here, that is the visceral mass. Okay, so let's see the respiration. So most mollusks, they do have the folded and the ciliated gills. Those gills are also known as the ctenidium. So if we see a molluscan body that contains a shell, that contains a mantle and has a visceral mass. So the mantle that will form a fold, and in between this fold and that of visceral mass, there will be a mantle cavity. So if we put a cut here and open the mantle cavity, we will gonna see the gills of the organism. So these are the gills. So what are the gills? Gills are the thin feathery sheets of tissue that are covered with the cilia. So if we see like this is the tissue that is attached with the mantle that contains a very numerous number of the gill leaflet, and they do bears many cilia on its surface. So alternatively, we cut the mantle cavity from here and put a transverse section. That transverse section will look like this. So these are the gills, and this is the gill leaflet. And if we see this gill leaflet, that will gonna show this kind of structure. So this is this one. So each gill leaflet that is attached with the mantle by means of outer mantle epithelium, and that is a kind of elongated structure, and that bears numerous cilia on its surface and contains many intercellular spaces, and these intercellular spaces that are filled with the blood. And if we these cilia that are present on the gill leaflet, they continuously beat and import the water from the surrounding environment, and that water contains the oxygen at higher PO2. So the PO2 in the water, that is very, very high, and the blood that is present in these intercellular spaces, they have lower PO2. So what happens, there will be a diffusion of oxygen takes place between the water and the blood. So the oxygenated blood that goes toward the heart. So that's how a gill that do work. In amphibian mollusks, so when the organism that is outside the water, so how it will gonna respire, they do have the lungs for that. So like this is the mental, and this is the visceral mass of organism. So what gonna happen? So this mental cavity that splits into two and form a sac or a cavity in between, and this is known as the lung. So like in case of amphibian snail, if we cut the TS, we will gonna see like this is the mantle. So that mantle that divided into two or split it into two, that forms lung roof and lung floor. The lung roof and lung floor, so contains a cavity that is known as the lung cavity, and this lung cavity opens into the mantle cavity by means of pneumatostome. That is the pneumatostome. So this is a aperture by which the air enters in this cavity, and that air that has a higher PO2 in comparison to the blood that is present in these sinuses that are present in the lung floor and lung roof. So the same kind of mechanism of the diffusion that happens in the lungs too. So that's how amphibian or terrestrial snail, they do respire by the means of lung, and those are the aquatic, they do respire by the means of that of the gills. If we talk about the circulation, the mollusk, they do have majorly the open circulatory system. However, in some mollusks, they are very, very active. They do have the closed circulatory system. So if we see the higher active is the animals, they needs more oxygen, and if the oxygen that is some kind of lazy, that will gonna require less oxygen. So because these cephalopods, they are the predatory in nature. So if organism that is predatory in nature, so it is the nature that organism must be very very active, or else the prey that will gonna leave. So for that mechanism, these cephalopods, they do have the closed circulatory system, and the heart is present, and that is that contains the 2 auricles and 1 ventricle with the few vessels like that of the aorta. However, as we have seen that the coelom is reduced, and it forms only the hemocoel around the heart, and that the coelom that is known as the pericardial cavity. The blood of the mollusk that contains various kind of cells, those cells, they contains the pigment. So if the pigment is red, that contain the iron, and that pigment is known as the hemoglobin. However, in most of the molluscan, the blood is blue, and that contains the copper as a central element, and that respiratory pigment is known as the hemocyanin. However, there are no clotting agent or the thrombocyte in the case of molluscan blood. Coming to the nervous system, so the nervous system comprises of various kind of ganglions that includes the cerebral ganglia, buccal ganglia, and pleuropedal ganglion. So if we see a molluscan body from the lateral side, so we can see this is the cerebral ganglia, this is the buccal ganglia, pleural ganglia, and the pedal ganglia. So this is one cerebral ganglia, one lies behind this. So these ganglions, they are connected with each other with a kind of connection. So if 2 similar kind of ganglion, like this is cerebral ganglia, so if two similar kind of ganglia, they are jointed together, that connection is known as commissure. And if 2 dissimilar kind of ganglia, if they are joining together, that is known as connective. So if that is the buccal ganglia, so this connection will be known as the cerebral commissure, and this connection that will be known as the cerebrobuccal connective. So in case of molluscan, they can have the simple nervous system as well as they can have the complex nervous system. Most of the mollusks, they do have the simple one, and the cephalopods, they do have the complex nervous system, and they are also considered as the most intelligent animals in the invertebrate group. However, this intelligence that make them different from other molluscan, because they are very very active predators. They can recognize the prey with their sharp eyes, and they don't have any blind spot in their eye like that do we have. So, and they can also learn by means of watching. However, their intelligence, that is still in question, because to attain a very high intelligence, the organism must have higher lifespan, and it must have very high social life. However, in case of in case of these cephalopods or octopus, they have the lower lifespan, as well as they don't have that much good social life. So the intelligence, how they get this much intelligence, this is still in question. Coming to the excretion in molluscan, they do have one pair of nephridia, and that nephridia is the kind of metanephridia. What are the metanephridia? When the nephridial, one duct that opens into the body cavity, and one duct that opens outside exterior. So mostly in the case of mollusk, that opens into the mental cavity. And in some molluscan, this nephridial tube that also act as gonoduct, means the duct of the gonad and that of the duct of the nephridia, they will be the same. So that duct will be known as the gonoduct. And the excretion can be happen by the means of body wall as well as the gills. And in some molluscan, they do have several pairs of the nephridia. The reproduction and development, the most mollusks, they are dioecious. However, some gastropods, they are monoecious one. And the development in case of molluscan, that is mostly the indirect one, and contains a characteristic larva that is also known as the trochophore larva. This trochophore larva is same as that of that present in the phylum Annelida. So what is the trochophore larva? That larva that has some kind of oval in shape and contains apical sensory plate at the anterior end and contains the apical tuft of cilia. Or apart from this apical tuft of cilia, they also contain three the round of cilia on the body that are the prototroch, mesotroch or the metatroch and the telotroch, and the mouth is there and a whole full alimentary canal that is present. This is the anus, this is the mouth. Some mollusks, they also contain a second larva that is known as belliger larvae, and this belliger larvae that is also a free swimming larvae as that of the trochophore larvae, and that contains the foot, shell and the mantle. In some, this belliger larva that becomes specialized one, and specialized in what? They contains some kind of larval cells and contains the hooks, and this larva is known as Glochidium larva. But the Glochidium larva is not a free swimming larva. It becomes the parasite on the gills of the fishes. Like these are the gills of fish, and so these Glochidium larvae, they attain a shape or a size of that of the small fish. So when the large fish, they eat this Glochidium larva, they get attached in the gills of the fish, and where they get they feed on those on the blood of the fish, and when they attain maturity, they develop into the adult bivalves and start the free living life. So the adult is free living, however the larva that is parasitic one, that is the Glochidium larva, and this larva mainly present in case of the bivalves. So this is all about for the general characters in the phylum Mollusca. Now we will see the classification of the phylum Mollusca. So one scientists like Rupert and Barnes, two scientists are there. They have given a classification in which they divided the phylum Mollusca into the 7 classes that are the Aplacophora, Monoplacophora, Polyplacophora, Scaphopoda, Bivalvia, Gastropoda and the Cephalopoda. However, according to the Brusca, they have divided the Aplacophorans into the 2 classes. One is the Cordofabiata and the another Solenogaster. So just Aplacophora that is divided into 2 classes according to the Brusca. So now there are 8 classes under the phylum Mollusca. So if we see the terminology, so A means absent, Placo means plates. So there is no shell present in case of Aplacophorans. So the Cordofabiata as well as the Solenogaster, they do lack shell. However, when there is mono means one. So when there is one shell that is present on the body, that are the Monoplacophorans. When they do have the many shell in the form of plates, that are known as the Polyplacophorans, like that of the chitons. When the Scapo means the shovel, so like this. So when the foot has this kind of shape, those organisms, they are known as the Scapopodans, and Scapopodans include the tusk shell and the tooth shell. So tusk like the tooth of animals, so they do have the similar kind of the shape. The class Bivalvia, Y means 2 and valve means 2 shell. So 2-shelled organisms, they are the bivalves. So muscle and clamps, they belongs to here. Gastropoda, the poda means foot, gastro means stomach. So the stomach and a foot, they lie together. So there will be a stomach and stomach that lies on the foot. And the cephalopods, poda means foot, cephalo means head. So when the head is just present on the foot, those organisms are known as the cephalopods. So octopus and squids, they belong to the cephalopods. Snail and slugs, they do belong to the gastropoda. So coming to the class first, that is the Cordofabiata, they also known as the Catodermomorpha. So they are also known as picklebum, and about 120 species of them is present. They are marine one and the benthic worms. Body is some kind of worm-like and cylindrical body, and they lack any trace of cell. So no cell is present on their body. And the body wall that has a chitinous cuticle and having the overlapped with the scale like calcareous sclerite. However, the body that will gonna have the chitinous cuticle and also contain a scales like the spicules. The mouth that is shielded, mouth shield is present at the anterior end of the body that surround the mouth. Like you can see here, this is the Caudophabiata. So there is oral shield that is present near the mouth. And mantle covers almost whole of the body. So this is the organism. So this mantle that will gonna present whole of the body except at the posterior end where it can form the mantle cavity. However, almost every part or surrounding that this mantle that will gonna surround whole of the body. And there will be a small posterior mantle cavity then that contains the bipectinate ctenidia, like we have seen in case of gills, like those gills are present on the mantle surface. So this kind of gills, they are known as the monopectinate gill, like they are present on a single side of the tissue. However, if this is the surface and both sides the gills are present, this kind of gill that is known as the bipectinate gill. And the radula is present in this case. They are the dioecious one and they don't have foot, eyes, tentacles, statocyst, ospiridium or the nephridium. They do lack. And they form a burrow in muddy sediments and consume microorganisms like that of Foraminiferans. And for example, they include the Chaetoderma and Cabroderma. So these are the Caudophabiaton. The second is the Solenogaster. So they do have the 260 described species. They are also known as the Neumeniomorpha. They are marine organisms. The body is still wormy like the worms and that is nearly cylindrical. However, they do lack the oral seal. There is no oral seal that is present near the mouth. And mantle is absent at the ventral side. Like in case of Caudophabiaton, we have seen that mantle that surround whole of the body. However, in case of Solenogasters, there will be these worms, they do lack the mantle at the ventral position. So this line that lack the mantle. So when the mantle is present absent at the ventral side, that ventral side have the groups that will gonna have form a kind of groups, and that group is known as the ventral group, and that actualizes as some kind of food and gonna help in the locomotion in case of the organism. And they are mostly the monoecious one. The previous we have seen they were the dioecious. And they are the epibenthic carnivores and consumes the cnidarians. The previous one they consume the microorganisms like Foraminiferans. They do consumes the cnidarians. So for example, there is Neumenia is the example for that. So this is the Solenogasters. The third class is the Monoplacophora. That means a single plate or undivided cell that is present on the body of an organism. So this is the single cell that is present on the body. And they actually, the scientists believe that they have been gone extinct. But a scientist in 1952 in the Costa Rica, they found a organism that is known as Neoplena. So after the discovery of Neoplena, the Monoplacophoran species, they have been now identified. About 25 species they have been identified till now. So this is Monoplacophorans. They are small and they have a size of 3 mm to 3 centimeter. They have the rounded cell with the ventral creeping foot. So this is the dorsal side, this is the ventral side. So you can see this is the foot, and by the means of contraction they can move. And in case of Annelida, you have seen they have the segmented body. Like the arthropod, they also have the segmented body. However, the segmentation that have been disappeared in case of phylum Mollusca. However, these the monoplacophorans, they show some kind of segmentation. And they do have the 3 to 6 pair of gills, like you can see here, and 8 pair of muscles. Muscles, they are present in pairs, and 3 to 7 pairs of kidney or the nephridia, they are present in these animals. So some kind of segmentation that is present, and that's why, so some kind of previous phylum characteristics you have seen, so they are also are the connecting link. Their head is without the eye, they lack the eye and have the radula for scraping food, and they do have the ladder-like nervous system, as you have seen in case of Platyhelminthes. The example is Neoplina. So the fourth class is the class Polyplacophora, that means the many plates. So here the organism that do have the convex upper surface of the body, and the ventral surface is the flattened one, and the shell that contain 8 overlapping plates. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. So 8 plates are present on the dorsal side of the body, and they are overlapping, and because of these plates, these kind of animals, they give some kind of appearance like the body is segmented. However, this pseudo appearance of segmentation of body is due to the shell plates. However, the body is unsegmented. They are fairly sedentary. However, they can move short distance to feed. So like the ventral surface is a flat one, so that binds with the that of the substratum. However, they can move a little bit for the feeding, and upon when they get detached from the surface, they can roll like that of the armadillo, like this. So if they get detached, the anterior and the posterior end, they can fuse together, and they can roll over the body. And the head and cephalic sensory organs in the case of the Polyplacophorans, they get reduced. So the sensory organs, they are reduced, and they are a dioecious one and having the trochophore larvae. So the development is the indirect one. For this example is the chitin, and these organisms, they do belongs to the order Neoloricata. So this is the ventral surface of chitin. This is the chitin that is attached to the substratum, and this is the ventral surface. So these are showing the gills that are present. Here is the mouth, here will be the anus, and this is the foot. If we see the fifth class is the Scaphopoda. So the scapho means the shovel, and poda means the foot. So shovel foot they do have, like and this is the foot of the animal. So that of the shovel, they are look like. So what happen in the case of Scaphopoda, they are actually some kind of sedentary individuals. However, they are not the sessile. That means they are not attached to the substratum. However, they use their foot to dig inside the sand. So their most of the body that is inside the sand, and one part of the shell that is in the water. And there are about 900 marine mollusk species. They belong to the class Scaphopoda, and they are about 2.5 to 5 centimeter in length, and some can reach up to 20 centimeter. They are the slender body with the tubular cells. So in the case of the Scaphopodans, the mantle that around the viscera, whole of the viscera, like this is the viscera that is present. So whole of the viscera that is surrounded by the mantle, and thus they form some kind of tube which is narrow at one portion and wide at the another one. So the wide portion of the shell that has the foot, and the anterior or the that is the narrow one that lies above the sand, and that is in the water. So they mainly feeds on the detritus and mainly the protozoa. So how they catch these protozoans? So they have cilia on their foot. So by the means of these cilia, they can catch those protozoans and take to the mouth. How and another mechanism associated, like they also have some kind of tentacles which have the clubbed end, and those tentacles, they have the mucus on their end, so they also help the organism to pick the pick the protozoans or the microorganisms. They don't have the gills, and so respiration in the case of Scaphopodon, that is taken up by the mantle cavity. So one of the example in case of the Scaphopoda, that is the Dentalium, and it belongs to the order Dentellida. So this is the Dentalium. This is the another photo of Dentalium. So this is the foot, this is the shell. So the next class is class Bivalvia, that means the two wall or two shell. They include the mussel, clams, scallops, oyster, and the seaworm. So the two shell are present in the body of organisms in which the organism is present, and these two shell, they are jointed together through the dorsal region. They can range from 1 mm to 1.5 meter in size, and all are the aquatic, and among aquatic they are mostly marine, some are brackish water and some are the freshwater. And the shell, that is literally compressed, having the two valve, and in the shell there is some kind of bulging part that is present at the dorsal end, and that dorsal end is the oldest part of the shell, and it is known as umbo. And the shell, like these two shells, that when they joint it together, through the dorsal end, and that dorsal end is continuous, that means there is no gap in between the two shell. However, the mantle secrete more protein at this region than the calcium carbonate to maintain the elasticity between the two shell. And these two cells, they held together by the means of adductor muscles that are present inside the cell. When these muscles contract, the cell is closed, and when these muscles relax, the cell get opened. There is no head, radula, or the spallation in case of the bivalves. They are dioecious. The fertilization mainly the external one, and they do have the swimming trochophore and the belliger larvae. And in some bivalves there is specialized belliger, that is known as Glaucidium larvae. We have already covered this larvae in the journal characteristics. However, in some cases the fertilization is internal. Here the gill provide the area where the egg hatch and act as the brood chamber. So the example for the bivalves are the Unio, Ostrea, and the Pinctada. Unio belongs to the order Unionidae, and they include the entire freshwater bivalves. The Ostrea, they belongs to the order Ostrida, and they are the true oyster. So the oyster which are edible, they do belongs to this order. And the Pinctada, that belongs to the order Pteridae, and they are the pearl oyster. You must have heard about the pearl culture or the pearl industry. The oyster that are used in the pearl culture, they do belongs to the order Pteridae. This is the belliger, this is the belliger inside the gill, and this is how the bivalves they do feed. So the water that is imported inside the mantle cavity by the incurrent opening, so water along with the oxygen, that also bring the food particle, and those food particles, they get entrapped by the cilia that are present on the gills. So gills transport those food particles by the means of cilia to the labial pulse, and labial pulse give those food particles to the mouth, and through the export route, the water that get outside through the excrement opening. So example is Unio, Ostrea, and the Pinctada. Unio, that has the equivalve cell, and equivalve means the two walls, one and that is behind this shell, they do have the same shape and the size. The shell of Unio, they are convex. Both of the cell, they are convex. In the Ostrea, and the shell are somewhat different. The left shell is larger and it is convex in shape, and the right one is smaller and it is flat in shape, and here the byssus is absent. So what are the byssus? We have already seen in case of general characteristics. In some bivalves, the foot, they release some kind of threads. Those are known as the byssal thread, and they help the organism to hang from the substratum. So these are the visceral threads. So they are released by the visceral gland. So viscus is absent in case of Austria. They do adhere to the substratum. On the other hand, the pink dada, the shell is coarse and the left wall that is larger. However, the viscus is present in the case of pink dada. So the next class is the class Gastropoda. They are extremely diverse group of animals. Those include the snails, slugs, abalones, limpet and the sea slugs. So this is snails, slug, limpet and the sea slugs. So they can vary from microscopic in size to 1 meter long, and they are present everywhere except the aerial lifestyle. So they are mainly sluggish and sedentary, like you have seen the snail. And the member of this class, they are usually parasitized by the variety of helminths. So like you have seen in the case of Hessiola hepatica, though they have parasitized the snail belonging to the genus Planorbis and Limnia. In the case of gastropodons, the shell is present. However, in some member like that of the slug, the shell is absent. And when the shell is present, that is usually with the degree of coiling. So when the shell is present, that is coiled one. However, in some member of the gastropodon, they don't possess shell like that of the slug, and if the shell is present, they don't have the coil. However, those members, they are also descended from the ancestor that has the shell with the coiling. And this spiral coiling in the shell that make the organism to be in lesser size. So the shell, the spiral shape in the shell make the compactness. The operculum may be present at the posterior dorsal margin of the foot. What is the operculum? So like in some gastropod, this is the operculum that is present in the shell. So what is the operculum? It is the posterior dorsal margin of the foot that get hardened. So what happens? So when the gastropodon retract its head and the foot inside the shell, that shell is covered by the operculum. So what is the operculum? This hard part of the foot. In addition to the coiling in the gastropodon, some of them also show the torsion. So what is the torsion? It is a rotation of the body. So in some gastropodon, they able to rotate their body anti-clockwise 180 degree. So like you have seen the typical molluscan body plan, then you have seen the gastropodon body plan. So what happened in this case, the mantle cavity as well as the gills, they are present at a posterior margin, and the alimentary canal that is straight. However, in this case, like you can see, the alimentary canal that is curved, and the gills as well as mantle cavity that lies over the head. So how this thing happen? This is because of the torsion. So like in the basic plan, we have seen that alimentary canal that is straight, the gills that are present at the posterior margin. However, what happened now? So the body and the mantle, they rotate 180 degree anti-clockwise, which let the alimentary canal to become twisted, and the gills, they come over the head. So this is known as the torsion. So what are the significance of torsion? It brings the gills in front the head to better gas exchange. Like this is the molluscan body. So what will gonna happen in this? So the water that will come through the mantle cavity, and when it will reach to the gills, it will be contaminated by the means of dirt. So the efficiency of gills for the respiration, that will gonna decrease. However, if the gills that are present at the anterior margin, so now water that will enter fresh, and the respiration efficiency for the lungs that will be, gills that will be increased. And as it will provide the more room for shell for retraction. Like in this case, what happened? The mantle cavity that lies at the posterior margin. So when during the retraction, the foot that will gonna retract first. However, head will remain outside, so that will not provide as much protection to the body. However, if the mantle cavity that lies at the anterior side, so now the head will move first inside the shell, and the protection is enhanced. And the third is the sense organ that comes in front. Like we have seen, along with that of lungs, there is osphidium that lies. So along with the lungs, like here, or the gills, there is osphidium, that is some kind of chemical sensor in the molluscan body. So along with the gills on the lungs, this ospiridium or the chemicals sensor that also come in front. So now when the sense organ they come in front, the organism that will become more sensible for the stimuli. And in some member there is also a detorsion. So what is detorsion? When the organism that undergoes torsion, it can undergo detorsion by rotation of the body 90-degree clockwise. So now at the torsion, when the mental cavity that opens over the head, now the mental cavity that will gonna open at the right side of the body. Most of the gastropods, they are herbivores, and some of them are the carnivores, like that of the moon snail and the oyster borer. But they uses the radula to scrape the shell of the bivalve and induce their digestive secretion inside the cell and digest the matter. Now when there is enough opening for the snail to get inside the bivalves, they enter inside the shell and prey on that. Some of gastropods, they are also predatory in nature, like that of the nudibranchs. So nudibranchs, they include the sea slugs and they don't have shell. So they feed on cnidarians like that of the corals, and but they utilize their undischarged cnidocytes. So they take their undischarged cnidocyte but don't digest them and express them on their body. So utilize their body defense as their own body defense. So in case of cnidarians, they use the cnidocyte as their body defense. However, these sea slugs, they eat the cnidarians and uses their undischarged cnidocyte for their own body defense. And in some sea slugs, they eat the algae and don't digest their chloroplast. However, they express them on their body and use them for the photosynthesis. In case of gastropodon, they also have gills, and gastropodons, they can be present on the terrestrial habitat, so they also have lungs for them. And they do have the eyes, statocysts, tactile organs, and the chemoreceptor with them. They can be monoecious or dioecious. However, there always will be cross-fertilization. Also, they can show the sequential hermaphroditism like that of the crapidula. So, what happens in case of crapidula, like that of limpet? So, when a larva in which the sex is not determined, that the larva that will gonna become the male or female, so that undescribed larva that don't have the sex determined, that comes to a bare substratum and attach that. So if there is nothing in their bottom, so that larva that develops into the female, and that larva that secretes some kind of chemical that attract the another larva in which the sex is not determined, that sit on that female larvae and develop as male. So sometimes they mate, and when the reproduction that is complete, so now the male reproductive organ of this limpet that will gonna degenerate, and now this male limpet that will gonna develop into the female one. So first it was male, now it is female. Now this female limpet that will again gonna secrete the chemicals that will attract the fresh larvae, and those fresh larvae that will lay on that limpet, and now this fresh larvae that develop as male. Now the mating happens in between these two, and when the reproduction is complete, the male reproductive organ of this limpet that will gonna degenerate, and it will gonna be the female. So this process continues, and they form some kind of stacks. So this is known as the sequential hermaphroditism. In the case of gastropodon, the development is indirect. So they do have the trochophore and the belliger larvae. For the example, the Pila, Helix and Doris, they do belongs to the class Gastropoda. The phyla belongs to the order or cohort Archaetenoglossa. They do give gills and they do have operculum. So, and they can be the land and freshwater snails. The helix, that do belongs to the order Stylomatophora, and they are terrestrial only. And here the mantle cavity act as lungs. However, there is no operculum that is present. In case of Doris, they are the slugs, so they don't have any kind of shell. So this is phyla, operculum is present. This is helix, there is no operculum. This is Doris, there is no shell. So the last class in the phylum Mollusca, that is the Cephalopoda, that include the nautilus, squids, cuttlefish and the octopus. So these are the nautilus, octopus, the cuttlefish, the squids, and these are the fossils ammonites. So about 800 living species that belongs to the cephalopods, and about 10,000 fossil species mostly belong to the ammonites. And there is a common thing in the gastropodon and that of cephalopodon to have the spiral shell. However, there is a big difference in the shell of gastropodon and cephalopod. That is, in case of gastropodon, the shell is continuous. However, in case of cephalopod, the shell is that do have the chambers. And these chambers are filled with the gas to provide buoyancy to the organism, and that help the organism to swim in the water. In the living species and the living member of cephalopods, only the nautilus that has the external shell, and other organisms under the cephalopods, either they don't have the shell or they do have the internal shell. And this sacrifice of the shell that is attributed to increase the speed to avoid the predators. They can be vary in size too. They can be of 2 centimeter to about 60 inches. About this giant squid, that is the most massive invertebrate, and they are the most active among the mollusks and most advanced in all the mollusca and even the echinodermata or all the invertebrata. And some of them, they argue that they are most advanced organisms in the invertebrate. So they also vary in the size from 2 centimeter to about 16 inches in length. The giant squid that belongs to the cephalopod, that is the most massive invertebrate, and they are also the most active and the most advanced in all the invertebrates. Some of the member like that of the octopus, they also have webbed tentacles and they can swim like that of the jellyfish. In their body, they also have the pigment cells. They are known as the chromatophores. These chromatophores, they are surrounded with the muscles, and when these muscles contract, the chromatophore, they get expands, and when they expand, they can change the color of the body, and thus they can produce the bars, stripes, spots and blotches on their skin. That leads to the title that is known as master of disguise. So they can control this the color of their body by the nervous and the hormonal mechanism. So this is the octopus that is releasing some kind of ink. Their head is indistinguishable from their foot, so that's why their name is head foot. So the head that is present on the foot, and that is elongated up to 8 to 10 arms. So 8 or 10 arms that can be present from the head, and in case of nautilus, they can be about 90. And among these 8 or 10 arms, 2 can be the longer one, and they are known as the tentacles. So the 2 tentacles can be present, or 8 to 10 arms they can be present. And they do have the beak-like jaws, which do have the radula. And as we have discussed, they do have the closed circulatory system that is more efficient for gas exchange and the transport. And they also have the accessory or the branchial hearts that get formed at the base of each gill, which improve the pumping efficiency for the closed circulatory system. So because there is they require more oxygen, so the blood pressure is need to maintain at higher pace. So at the base of each gill there is some kind of muscular bulb like thing that by producing some kind of contraction that push the blood more pace and increase the blood pressure, that leads to for the better efficiency for the gas exchange. And they also have the most developed brain and the better sense organs in comparison to whole of the invertebrates. They can also has the ink sac for the protection, and this ink that is made of the pigment that is known as the melanin. And when this melanin that is produced inside the ink sac, that can be released to outside by the means of siphon that is present on their head, and this is for to escape from the predators. They can be dioecious and they can have the direct development. So the larvae, they are not present in case of the sphelopods. So there are some example like that of sepia, octopus and the nautilus. So in case of sepia, they belongs to the order Sepida. Here the shell is internal. They do have 8 long arms and 2 tentacles. So what is the difference between the tentacle and the arms? The tentacles, they have the suckers on their proximal position only. So like this is the head of organism, these are the tentacle or arm. So the arm, they do have sucker on at every position. However, the tentacles, the tentacles, they do have the sucker only at the proximal position. The octopus, that belongs to the octopoda, and in this the cell is either vestigial or it is absent, and they only has the arms, they lacks the tentacles. In case of nautilus, they do have the external cell and the tentacle number can be of 80 to 90 and they are suckerless. So this is the nautilus, this is sepia, that is the cuttlefish, this is octopus, and this is the ammonite fossils. So you can see the nautilus, that is the same morphology as that of the ammonite, and the pattern of the shell, that is the same also. So nautilus is considered as the modern counterpart that of the ammonite. So this is all for the general characteristics and the classification of phylum Mollusca. So if you have doubts, you can ask them in the classroom, or else I will bring some. And thank you for listening. Thank you.